welcome guys to another video. Today we've got the LMP2 guide for Le Mans. Unfortunately, I am out of driving for these hot laps, and we've got a hot lap from Luciano, thankfully. Unfortunately, 2 days ago, I was hit by a car at work. I was stood cleaning a window, and an old man was driving a car, didn't see me, so didn't brake until he hit me, which was at around 20 mile an hour. By some miracle, I've only broken my thumb, but because it's my right thumb, it's very difficult to drive, so I'm out of driving for at least 2 weeks. So that's a bit unfortunate, but thankfully Luciano was able to do the hot lap for us, so we can still do the track guides and things like that. So let's get into the hot lap and then we'll have a look at the guide. So now that we've had a look at the hot lap, let's have a look at the guide. So for the first corner, we're pretty much full throttle in qualifying, and we're looking for the blue cone on the right hand side. So as we approach the first corner, we want to open it up as much as possible. We can go onto this runoff area on the right hand side, and there's a blue cone here on the right hand side. And just as we pass that, we begin to turn in for the corner. Now you want to begin to come off the throttle just before we start to straighten out the wheels. So as we get to the end of this right-hander, we're coming off the throttle and onto the brakes. Be careful that your tire isn't on the curb. As you see, Luciano has one tire on this side of the curb and one tire on this side of the curb, so it's fine to brake here. Whereas if you brake with one tire on the curb, it can trigger the, well, it doesn't have ABS, but it triggers sort of a lockup. So you have to be careful with when you initially apply the braking force. But you want to get on the brakes down into second gear. Keep it on the right hand side of the track as much as possible, just to open up this left hander. And now we begin to turn in around about here, and we're basically aiming for the start of this yellow sausage curbs on the inside. They look like big sausage curbs, but they're actually quite flat, so you can take a lot of them. We want to get on the power just before we get to the first one. So as we see here, just before we get to that first curb, we're onto the power, which, as we've said before, lifts up the front of the car. And we want to take quite a big section of that curbing. As you see, the left side of the car is going over the middle of that middle curb. So we want to take quite a bit of curbing there without triggering the track limits, obviously. And then the second part of this corner is quite difficult because we're going uphill. So the rear tends to step out sometimes. Now, the setup that we built for this track, the TC slip is quite low. If you don't like the rear stepping out on corners like this, you can turn that TC slip up and that will stop that. But if you can just manage the power and open up your wheel earlier, then it is a lot quicker to have a lower TC. So for the second part, as you see, just going down to about 80% power, 78% power, sorry, just to get that turning, and then lifting just as we get to these curbs, not taking as much as the first part, but still taking those yellow sausage curbs, and then trying to unwind the steering wheel and aim for this first track limit board. So unwinding the steering wheel nice and early, getting on the power, and that is kind of our exit point. And as you see, the rear steps out a little bit here with that low traction control, but just a simple correction, keeping the wheels straight, and we're absolutely fine. Just have to be careful not to go too wide on the exit, otherwise you will trigger the slowdown. And now for this left then right, we're just staying on the left side of the track. We can use all of this curbing on the left, it's nice and flat, and then turning into the right hander just as we begin to get to the end of this curb on the left. Just after we pass that, we go into the right hander. And now we're looking for these 4 cones on the right hand side and this escape road, and we brake about halfway between the two. So between this escape road and this cone, about halfway, we want to get onto the brakes. Down into third gear, there's some beautiful camber on the left side here, so trailing the brakes, but not on the brakes for very long, as you see. So we're braking about halfway between the two, a lot of pressure, but then we're almost completely off the brakes by this point. So before we even get to the apex, we're off the brakes, and then just let it coast a little bit to the apex. And then once we feel the car is gripped up, then we get onto the power, start to open up the steering wheel and aim for the right hander. Now, this right hander, we want to apex really late. We're apexing between the end of the blue and yellow curbing here and this final bollard. Around about here is where you want to apex. Now, the reason for that is that we want to get this late apex because if we allow the car to drift out to the left too early, there is some horrible camber on the exit that drags you to the grass. So we want to make sure we stay on this right side as we come up over this bump. Because if we get too far onto the left, see this curb, if you get a left tire over that white line, because of that camber to the left, you end up getting stuck onto either the curb or the grass, and it just pulls you into the wall. So you have to consciously get a late apex on that right hander so that you're not drifting out to the left on the exit here. Now for this right hander, this is really crucial corner because we've got such a long straight to the next chicane. So it's really crucial that we carry as much momentum into this corner as possible. Now on the left here, we've got this board. I think this is a flag board. I think this is the one that would light up yellow or red flag. So we're using that as a reference. And just as we cross that line, we're tapping the brakes only about 20%, shift down into fourth gear, and then we're trying to just coast up to the apex and then get on the power just before we get to the curbing,
taking as much curbing as we can without triggering the track limit warning. Not using the sausage curb, just the the blue and yellow curbing on the apex. And then we can use all this exit curbing. Now, what I found was that the track limit was this edge. If your right tire went over the edge of this curb, is where you would trigger the track limit warning. And there's such a long straight, especially in a race, this costs you a lot of time. So using all the way up to this might gain you, say, half a tenth or a tenth by the end of the straight. But if you do it wrong, you're going to lose over a second by serving that slowdown. So in quali, it's obviously you want to maximize this exit. But in the race, sometimes it's worth just being a bit cautious on this exit because the slowdown is not worth the tenth that you will gain. So just be careful on this exit, but it's very important for your lap time to get a really good exit out of this corner and just carry as much momentum as possible. So going into the first of the two chicanes, we're looking for the end of this barrier on the left-hand side and the 100-meter board. And we want to brake about halfway between these two reference points. Now we can brake all the way up to 100% because we're at such a high speed and we've got so much downforce, we can brake at 100%. And then as we begin to slow down and there's less weight on the car, we then need to release that braking pressure and trail it. So as we get to this first cone is where we're going to begin looking to turn in for the apex and beginning to trail off of the brakes. Now we're looking to take quite a bit of this curbing on the right hand side, and we want to put the right front tire over this yellow and blue curbing to hook the car around the corner. So that little hook is going to help us hook around the corner. We do want to be careful with these curbings because we've got so much momentum. This is kind of like the right-hander at the end of the long straight at Spa. If you are too aggressive with your steering inputs or you come off the brakes too quickly, there's so much weight transfer happening, it's very easy just to spin yourself. But third gear, still on the brakes, and then once we straighten out the wheel, we're increasing the brake pressure to slow it down a little bit more for this left-hander, down into second gear, and we're looking for this bollard as the apex. So we're looking to apex around about where that bollard is, and again putting the left front tire over this curbing to hook it round. Be careful for track limits through this chicane. It can be quite easy to trigger them, but we want to get on the power just as we pass this apex. So just as we pass that bollard, as that disappears, we're getting onto the power. Unwinding the steering wheel nice and early, and again, just being careful with track limits on this curbing. We can put this right front tire just on the edge here, but just be careful with the track limits, and then unwinding the steering wheel, trying to put as little steering input as possible, and just let the car drift out wide. On this straight heading up to the next chicane, be careful not to drive too far over to the left or over to the right because it's very bumpy on the edge. You want to keep the car as flat as possible on the straight. Okay, so looking at the second chicane, we're looking for this 100-meter board on the right hand side and we're braking just before we get to that. Now another reference is, see there's a line of trees here quite close to the track, and this last one here is where we brake. So you can either use just before the 100-meter board or you can use the last of the trees on the right, whichever's easier for you as a reference marker to use. Depending on your graphic settings, you might have the trees turned on or off, so just whichever is easier for a braking reference. But again, we can brake at about 100% initially, and then just before we get to this cone on the right hand side, we're trailing off and we're turning in just as we pass that orange cone. And again, left front tire onto the inside of this blue and yellow curbing. Quite an early apex. See where this line crosses is about the apex. That's where we want to get onto the curb, and then hook it around to the left, and then over onto the right. We're braking, a little bit more pressure, and then trailing off the brakes just before we get to the apex. And again, we're using the bollard as our apex marker, front right over that blue and yellow curbing, and getting on the power just before the curb, just before the apex. So just before we get to the bollard, we're onto the power, and then unwinding the steering wheel nice and early, And again, we can use a little bit of this blue and yellow curbing. We don't need to use as much because it's a bit of a wider exit. And we can go over to the right here on the exit if we need to. But again, just as we go to the next corner, just try not to drive on any of the bumpy sides of the straight. Just try and keep the car as stable as possible. Okay, so now into this right-hander. This is probably, I found, one of the easiest corners to lock up when I was building this setup before I got hit by a car. And what I found for a good reference was basically using this orange cone and trying to then straight line from there. So Luciano does the exact same thing. So I'll show you what I mean. So at that orange cone, we're aiming to begin to turn in just after that. And instead of trying to get over here, we're aiming to be over here. So as you see here, we begin to brake just before this light marker. So just before that disappears, we're onto the brakes, and then I'm basically, Luciano is trying to brake as straight as possible. So as you see, a little bit of steering input just to get it around that right-hander, and then we're basically aiming for this orange cone and trying to keep the wheel as straight as possible as we apply the brake. Because if we've got too much steering input, the car is going to lock up. So we're aiming for this orange cone and trying to keep the wheel as straight as possible, and then beginning to trail off down the gears into second gear and then into first gear just before we get to this orange cone. And we can use this as our turn-in reference. So we turn in as we pass that, and then there is a bollard just behind this one in the middle, and we want to apex there. As you see, this bollard, that's our apex reference. So we want to apex there, then unwind the steering wheel really wide on the exit, and we want to use this tarmac on the other side of the curb so that we can open up the steering wheel really nice and early and get on the power super early, and then get a really good exit out of that right-hander. Again, there's a really long straight after this into the next corner. So having a look at Indianapolis now, this is quite a popular place for incidents. So for our braking reference, after we pass 100-meter board, we're looking on the left side, and we're looking for this wide green patch of tarmac. And where that ends is where we want to put a little bit of braking force. So just before that ends, we're off the throttle, and then just as we get to the end of it, we're applying about 10-20% and shifting down into fifth gear, and we're basically trying to apex at the end of this blue and yellow curbing. So a little bit of braking into fifth gear now just as we get to the end of that curbing, and we want to be on the right side of the track. And as soon as we straighten the wheel, then we want to increase the braking pressure. So as soon as the wheel is straight, now we want to increase the braking pressure. We want to be over to the right-hand side of the track, and there's a nice bit of camber on the left-hand side. So we want to turn in just as we get to the end of this blue and yellow curbing into second gear, and we're aiming to just get the left side of the car into this nice little dip to hook it around the corner, and off the brakes by the time we get to the apex here, and then onto the throttle at this point here to open up the exit of the corner. There's a nice wide curbing on the exit, so we can use all of that, and then bring it back over to the left. This is another easy corner to lock up because it's quite slow. We're not at that highest speed. It's quite easy to lock up into this corner. So we're looking for the 15-meter board here on the left-hand side, and we brake just before we get to there. So this is where we brake. I can't really see a reference marker. I was just using just before we get to the 50-meter board as my reference. And braking down the gears, looking for this orange curbing, and down into first gear now. Sorry, orange curbing, orange cone. We want to be on the left tire on the inside of this blue and yellow curb here. But we're looking for that orange cone, and when we pass that, then we turn in for the corner. There isn't much on the apex, but we can use this blue and yellow curb on the right hand side, and then use a little bit of that to hook us around to the right, and then again open up the steering wheel as early as possible as we're getting on the power. And there's a really nice wide exit here that we can use. As you can see, you can go all the way up to the edge of this blue and yellow curbing. I wouldn't go any wider because you risk touching the grass on the exit, but just make sure you get that steering wheel opened nice and early. Okay, so now this is where the LMP2s are the best fun at Le Mans, because this is the high downforce, high speed corners. This is where the car feels really nice. So we're looking for the 100-meter board, and we're looking for the start of this wide section of tarmac. And about halfway between those two markers is where we get on the brake. So you see this wider section of tarmac here where that starts. Halfway between this and the 100-meter board is where we want to get onto the brakes. We want to be on the left side of the track, down into 5th gear now, and then beginning to turn in just as that wider section of tarmac disappears. We begin to turn in into 4th gear, little bit of braking, and off the brakes by this point. So before we get to the apex, we're off the brakes, coasting, and then getting on the power before we get to the start of that blue and yellow curbing, trailing onto the power, and now we're full onto the power. Using this blue and yellow curbing, we don't want to drift out too far to the left. We want to go to the middle of the track, then bring it back over to the right to open up this left-hander. We don't need to open it up too much. We don't need to be all the way over to the right. We just don't want to be too far to the left. We begin to turn in at this point, and now there is a little shed on the right-hand side. We turn in as we pass that, so you can use that as a reference if you like, or this truck before we get to that, whichever is easiest. But as we cross the line of where the shed is where we begin to turn in for the left-hander. Left-hander is full throttle. We want to beginning to get onto this blue and yellow curbing just at the start of it. So as you see, as that starts, we're already almost onto the curb. Using a lot of that curb, that's going to help us slide the car a little bit at the apex, which is what you want because that's going to give us a little bit more rotation. Let it drift out to the right hand side. Be careful not to go too close because this is just a wall and will destroy the car. So be careful that you don't hit the wall, but you can use this blue and yellow curbing. But in race scenarios, you might want to be careful with how much you push the exit of this corner. And then we begin to turn in again for the left-hander. At this point, there is this like triangle of 2 tire marks you can use as a turn-in point as we get to that, but that's not always going to be visible, so you're best just to get a feel for it. But we want to aim to turn in for the left-hander. Just as we see this blue and yellow curbing, we want to aim for that, and we're off the power just to get turned in. So at this point, we begin to come off the power, and we keep about 30%, 20%, 30% power just to keep the rear stable and planted, but we do need to come off the power a little bit to get that turn in. And again, we're using quite a bit of that blue and yellow curbing. And then as this marker becomes in line with our car, then we want to begin to let the car drift out to the right, and we're now looking for the right-hander. And as we pass this marker board, we're then turning in for the right-hander, and we're braking just before we get to the line of that marker board. So just before we get to that, we're onto the brakes, only about 40%, down into 4th gear, into 3rd gear now, and then we're getting off the brakes just before this blue and yellow curbing starts, letting it coast round the apex. It's almost a double apex though, as we see here. So we're hitting this apex here at the start of this blue and yellow curbing, and then we let it drift out wide a little bit, and then we bring it back in at the end of this blue and yellow curbing, and we get on the power about midway through the corner. So just as we pass this escape road, we get back onto the power, bring it over to the right hand side because we want to open up the upcoming left-hander. So it's a double apex for that right-hander, but as you see, that then allows us to be on the right hand side, and we brake and turn in for the left-hander about here. I couldn't really find a reference marker. There is this pole on the right hand side, but that's very difficult to see. But you can use that just as that disappears off my middle monitor is where Luciano gets off the power and then onto the brakes, only about 5% braking just to get the nose turned in. You could even just lift off the power. Depending on the track condition, you might not even need to touch the brakes at all. In 4th gear, and then already back on the power way before we even get to this curbing, but we're aiming to get onto the blue and yellow curbing as it starts. So we're aiming to get the left tire here. So as that curb starts, we are on the curbing, not needing to use the sausage curbs on the inside, just this blue and yellow curbing, and then unwind the steering wheel. Be careful for track limits. This is very similar to the right-hander just before the first straight, that you can use this blue and yellow curbing, but you can't go any wider than that, otherwise you will trigger the track limit warning. So as you see, put the left tire on this blue and yellow curbing, but if you go onto this rumble stuff, you will get a I think it's a 1 second or a 1.5 second slowdown. So just be cautious of that. Okay, so going into the final two chicanes, we're looking for this pit road on the right hand side as our marker. Now, between the start of this pit road and the end of it, about halfway between the 2 points is where we want to get on the brakes. So getting onto the brakes now, down into third gear, and right over to the right hand side of the track to open up this as much as possible. But we're going all the way into third gear and begin to turn in. You'll notice that this curb on the right hand side is really wide here, and then it changes to a normal curb. And at this point where that changes, this point here, that's about our turning point for the apex, and we're aiming for this track limit board in third gear, trailing the brakes all the way up to the curb, and then just as we approach that curb, we're off the brakes and we're aiming to get as close to this track limit board as possible. And we're not on the brakes, we're not on the power. And then just as we come off that curbing, then we have a little touch of the brakes just to get it turned in for the right-hander. And again, we're aiming to get as close to this track limit board as possible. But again, no no throttle input, just a tiny touch of the brakes just to get it turned in, just 3 or 4%. And then as we get past this apex, we're apexing really late. As you see, we're actually apexing at this second yellow sausage curb. So at that second one, that's kind of our apex point. Little bit of power just to bring it over to the right hand side, because we want to be over at this blue and yellow curbing. And then as we get to that blue and yellow curbing, we're braking just before we get to it, down into first gear, and we're turning in just before that curbing starts, aiming to take as much of this curbing as possible, because we want to open up the final corner as much as possible. So off the brakes just before we get to the curbing, and basically trying to apex at this middle yellow sausage curb, taking a lot more curb than you think you can, and getting on the power around about the apex. So just before we hit, that's the middle sausage curve there, just before we hit that, we're onto the power a little bit, and then turning in for the right-hander, aiming to clip the peak of this blue and yellow curbing on the right-hand side. Just a little bit of a lift from 30% down to 20% power, just to get the nose turned in. And as soon as we've got that nose turned in and we've hit that curb, then we start to apply the power and unwind the steering wheel. This is very similar to turn 3. The rear will step out here. You can increase traction control if you don't want that to happen, but it is much quicker to run a low traction control slip and then just manage the steering and the power. So unwinding that steering wheel nice and early and just modulating your power input until you have grip. But that is it for the guide, guys. I hope you enjoyed. Hopefully I will be back to driving the hot laps in a couple of weeks. But thank you to Luciano for doing the hot lap for us. And as always, guys, thank you very much for watching. Hope you enjoyed, and see you again next time.